Good evening. And tonight we're very delighted to welcome to the program two very, very interesting people who are going to be discussing with us the implications of a recent document that came out from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops called Economic Justice for All, which is the recent pastoral that was voted overwhelmingly by the Catholic bishops. Our guests are Sister Lucille Bonvelour, who lives in Burlington and is now a staff person with the Committee on Temporary Shelter, COTS, a group which is doing an outstanding job in making certain that the poorest people in our community have adequate food and adequate shelter. And to Lucille's right is Ed Block, who has a long history in the trade union movement. Ed was an international representative for the United Electrical Workers for 34 years, and Ed is presently a member of the Labor Religious Coalition of New York State. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, Lucille, maybe you can begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the Sisters of Mercy with whom you're associated and some of the work that you're doing and what this pastoral letter means in terms of your efforts.
As Bernie suggests, I am a Sister of Mercy and have been for over 25 years. I guess probably I need to reflect on why I'm really maybe became a Sister of Mercy, why I'm serving the homeless population. And I guess that's basically because I have a real sense of a need to serve. That's a very personal kind of need. And I guess probably when I think about the Sisters of Mercy, it is the spirit of the foundress, Catherine McAuley, that really is a driving force for me. Catherine McAuley founded the Sisters of Mercy back in the early 1800s in Ireland. She found that there were a lot of poor people, and in particular women, who needed housing. And it was to this group in particular that she reached out. She started some housing, some facilities for housing young women who needed shelter. It's her sense of dedication that I find a real moving force for me. In that context, I think I've had a growing desire to serve the homeless, and I was delighted when the opportunity arose for me to associate myself with COTS. I had been associated with them early on and left town and came back and am really delighted with the direction they're taking, because we've moved really from temporary shelter to looking at longer range needs.
Lucille, some of you and I are familiar with what COTS is doing. Some of the viewers may not be. Why don't we tell them a little bit about the problem that we're attacking, what we've been doing over the last 5 years, and what you are doing in particular.
Okay. Back just about 5 years ago now, there were growing numbers of homeless on our streets, and there was an uprising of concern from various segments of the community. Folks gathered together and literally put together an organization which housed people. We started Christmas Eve of 1982 and operated through April 15th of 1983. After that point, we had to go back to the drawing board and see where we could get monies, where we could get a facility. But we started at the Sarah Holbrook Center, actually. And since that time, COTS found a facility in the Wilson Hotel, which is located on Lower Church Street. The shelter opened there. We discovered that the building was available for sale and purchased that and are we're operating that as affordable housing for low-income people. After that, there was the opportunity to start the Street Work Project, which is the social service arm of the agency. That is
Okay.
wonderful.
And I know that we have come a long way.
Mhm.
There's been a whole lot of, as you point out, organizations in the city have been involved in this thing, and I think what we can say right now is, especially at a time when the federal government, to a large degree, in terms of funding, has turned its back on this population, and the state government, in my view, while making some good efforts, has not done enough. I think we can say that at least this community has responded, so that we can say that people are getting at least some shelter and food that they need. Ed, let me jump to you now. Your background is very different, but actually I think we're probably going to end up at the same place anyhow.
I hope so.
You come in a different direction. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in the labor movement and how that leads you to looking at documents like this and the relationship of religion to social problems.
Well, as you said, for 34 years I was active in the United Electrical Workers as an organizer and as an international representative, and always very clear that the political element of everything that we did was becoming more and more paramount. And also I'm deeply involved. I'm ethnically Jewish, but I'm a member of the Presbyterian Church and have been for a while, and active in that regard. So it was natural for me to look with a lot of interest on this growing marriage, as I see it, between the labor movement and the mainline religions, with no question about it, with the Catholic Church taking the lead and providing that leadership. And I think that the document that we have here is extraordinary and an enormous opportunity.
I agree, and I think maybe we should talk about, just briefly talk about some of the strong features of this document, which I have to say, I mean, I was astounded and delighted in reading this document. This was, I think, the third and final draft, was it? They go through three drafts. I had read the second draft, and just the truth of the matter is there are probably not more than a half a dozen people in the United States Congress, literally, who have the courage to come out and talk about issues like this. We're talking about issues...
Criticize themselves as well as other people.
Right, right. All right, Ed, maybe you want to take a shot at just talking about what you see as some of the highlights of this.
Well, I think they're pretty courageous, as you say, in calling their shots as they see them, recognizing poverty, recognizing the polarization of the United States community to a degree that has taken place never in my lifetime. I've got some years on it. So I think with a lot of clarity, I mean, it is a long document. You're not going to be able to read it before you go to sleep at night. But all of that is necessary. The background, incidentally, as a Jew, I was really moved by the degree to which they recognized their relationship with Old Testament faith and with the New Testament growing out of the Old. And historically, they've underlined that in a lot of ways. Well, beyond that, they have taken a clear shot at what is wrong with things the way they're developing this country, why there is poverty, why there are incredibly a degree of unemployment that's maintaining itself at 7% officially and going far beyond that in fact.
Lucille?
I think maybe one of the things that I'm pleased about is that the document talks about the rights of people. There are some certain basic rights that people have, be they food, shelter, clothing, medical care, education. Some of those, they're basic, and that every person has a responsibility in that.
Are those rights, you know, you brought that up, and I have no idea, do human beings have rights to these things, or?
They claim they do.
Well, let's discuss that one. I think, Lucille, you want to maybe deal with that?
Do people,
can people expect that they do have a right, or do they have to, or have you got to fight for something, or do you, the whole idea of a right to these things.
Okay, I think that part of that connects with then I think people do have a right, and they should be able to expect that. In fact, that's not the way our system often works. A lot of people do not have power. And so one of the other things that the bishops address is we must be involved, and we must help people to become involved. And that's critical, and that creates a major change when people become involved in changing their life.
One of the criticisms of this document, which came from actually people close to President Reagan in the Catholic Church, and they were saying, what, are you an economist?
No.
Are you a major business person in this country? Are you a head of a corporation? What do you know about the difficulties of running major businesses, the economic challenges that this country faces? How dare you? Why should you be involved in telling us that people have human rights in terms of housing, health care, minimum wage, for example? Aren't you overstepping your bounds? Why doesn't religion just simply do its job on Sunday and leave the business community to run the world Monday through Friday?
I think
What's your response to that?
There's a whole sense of the dignity of the human person. And I mean, that's number one. I think we could even go beyond the religion thing. Last night I was watching the CBS News, and I was delighted that they were showing a study that had been done that was connecting, it was, I believe, a genetic study that was connecting us way back to the first woman, however many years ago that was. In essence, we're saying that every time that when we are fighting the wars, when we're helping people, whatever we're doing, we're helping our brothers and sisters, literally, not just from a philosophical point of view.
Could I get into this,
Sure.
Bernie? I think there's a really important difference from this letter and the pastoral letter and the previous one and the ones that came before it. And I've heard Catholics say this, so I don't feel as though I'm being unfair about it. In the past, the bishops or whoever was uppermost in the hierarchy would come out with a statement, and that was it. There was no discussion. The past two, the pastoral on peace and the pastoral on the economy, have meant a 3-year effort with discussions involving literally hundreds of people, including Michael Novak and William Simon,
Right.
you know, the foremost critics of this document. And over again, they were given an opportunity to state their point of view. So it isn't simply the bishops stating this as expert, but the bishops drawing a bottom line conclusion from expert testimony at all sides, on all sources. They do concede what they call a preferential option for the poor. That's their bias, that they feel their faith, and the Old Testament faith requires. But the process is a very new one,
Right.
involving a cast of thousands, if you like.
And my understanding is also that the church has put substantial sums of money into making sure that this document is disseminated and discussed.
I think that's probably true. I don't have specifics on that, although I did, I was reading an article, I guess in the New York Times, that was saying that in Maryland anyway,
Right.
they were being very state-specific on how to implement the document.
Well, this sounds, I mean, the criticism of this is, why is the church getting involved in politics? All right? All right? Shouldn't there be this great separation between religious belief and real life? I don't think that there should be myself, and that's why I'm delighted by this. But I would like, Lucille, take a crack at that one.
Separation of church and state, basically, in the everyday life. I think, if I think of church and I think of lived faith, I think that's precisely it. It's lived. It's day in and day out. The words are nice, but they don't touch the human person. So I say, well, we have to be brothers and sisters and help each other, and I don't help. There's something the matter with that. I think then my words don't ring true.
Okay. And then when we talk about help, then it's obviously necessary to begin to talk about specific programs.
That's right.
For example, this document mentions the question of distribution of wealth in this country, which I think almost everybody acknowledges the gap between the rich and the poor are growing, and it's enormous.
Mhm.
Some people have tremendous wealth, many people, as you know, on a daily basis, have virtually nothing.
That's right.
Now, if we're gonna deal with that problem, it's gonna take government action, all right?
Right.
So that's an issue. Minimum wage, they were very specific, right here. They
Mhm.
talked about raising the minimum wage. And they raised an issue which I thought was really fantastic, and you talked about the whole issue of powerlessness.
Mhm.
And one of the issues that they get right into here is the powerlessness of workers. We have seen recently here in the state of Vermont a number of, and I know the United Electrical workers throughout this country has had to deal with this, of course, is somebody goes to work on a Monday and finds out that, oh, by the way, you've worked here for 30 years, but guess what? We've closed down the factory, we're moving to Latin America or someplace, and you don't have your job.
It's the kind of thing that working people simply can't deal with. It's a brand new era, a totally new weapon that's been used fairly well, no question.
Basically, a handful of people are deciding whether or not economic enterprises stay or not. Now, this document suggests that workers have got to have a say in that process as well,
Mhm.
which is quite a radical statement given the nature of economic life in America. Ed, you want to touch on that one for a bit?
Well, it's certainly essential, and I'd just like to point out that there's nothing really radical in terms of what the other countries in the world are doing. In all the European countries, working people do have a say in what happens. And in fact, if a fact were to move into Burlington by federal law, there would have to be an environmental impact statement, or if it shuts down the same thing should be true with respect to the social life. There should be an economic impact statement. If within 4 days after the last election, I ran for office, so I know I can feel just exactly how rough it was. Within 4 days, 15 major plant shutdowns were announced, and enormous, tens of thousands of layoffs in addition. All right, what is this? This is a political question. So in response to the question you raised, Bernie, religion and life, religion and politics, everything is political. Everything that happens here is political. And if we are people of faith, whether we go to an organized religious service or not, if we are people of faith, that requires, in my view, that we react politically. So this is the kind of thing that I really believe in.
Lucille, did you want to add to that or take it? No?
No.
Okay. It seems to me, we always make great pretense about concern about the poor. Everybody says it all the time. And yet the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. We spend more and more money on nuclear weapons and on military budgets, and you have more and more people sleeping in the streets throughout America. The housing crisis from one end of this country to the other is abysmal. The actual standard of living for most workers is in decline. Right.
Since '67, since they started using the stats on the cost of living, '67, the overall picture is down.
And it seems to me what this document is beginning to show is that, as you said, Lucille, it's not enough just to talk about nice things. If one is concerned about the poor, if one is concerned about the plight of women or of working people, then somebody's going to have to stand up and talk about specific ideas as to how we can improve those conditions. And when you talk about that, you're really talking about one word. It's called politics. Okay. And I think this, to my mind, does not raise any great constitutional crises between church and state. No one is suggesting that anyone has got to become a member of this or that religion, or the government has got to fund religion, or vice versa. What you're talking about and what you are saying is that if people hold moral values, religious values, it's not enough just to make them empty phrases. They've got to be implemented into reality. You can't talk about You can't talk about, it seems to me, peace, obviously of concern to moral people from time immemorial, and not understand what's going on in Nicaragua, what's going on around the whole world. Okay, and again, I cannot be happier. I agree with what Ed said before. I mean, we've heard a number of religious statements, but that the Catholic Church itself speaks out so boldly on this issue at a time, by the way, when many religious denominations are becoming more conservative, if you like. Okay, that at this time the church is willing to take the lead on this, I think is fantastic.
With this caveat, maybe, one of the many things I've been impressed with in the Catholic leadership, I'm talking especially around Albany, New York, where Bishop Hubbard holds sways, they don't want the exclusive rights to this. They're glad. That is the position now, the formal position of the Catholic Church, but it is not the possession of the county.
Precisely, right.
And they don't want to be possessed by their possessions either. They're delighted to have the other documents of faith introduced into the discussions that we're bringing up.
Right.
It seems that, I guess for me, that's one of the things that's pretty exciting is that, as a church, as an official church, we're making some statements, and I think that's important, number one. And number two, if we can get that to the people and get
Yes.
folks really talking and
Yeah.
acting out of this, making it come alive, it would be wonderful. And
Yeah.
take it to the pews.
There's a real chance, there is a chance.
Yeah.
I'm convinced there is a chance.
You know, one of the things that concerns me, and you see it especially when you go speak to young people, and I go into the schools pretty often, is the lack of sense of purpose, in a sense, that exists within the society. Ultimately, what the system tells you is that it's every person for themselves, and that what you have to do is scrape and push and shove your way up the ladder so that someday you too can have a lot of money and buy a nice fancy car and become the top of the system there. And that's really the value system
Yeah.
that the establishment perpetuates. And I think what this is saying, and I, you know, your point is well taken, Ed, that this is something that I think the church is aware, wanting to bring other denominations, all of us into, is to say maybe that should not be the value structure of this country. Maybe there's something more to strive for in human life other than becoming rich and powerful and exploiting other people. Maybe there are other values that make life somewhat more meaningful.
And all of a sudden, that has a real cutting edge, that is a political cutting edge, because as you say, working people have begun to give up. The people that you work with, sister, they're just discouraged beyond belief, I'm sure.
Right.
I don't know them. I come up here to visit my daughter Linda and Nat on New Year's Eve.
And you're on television the next day, right?
But, so that I don't know people that well, but I know they're all over the same thing obtains. Now there seems to be nothing on the horizon that's really going to provide a positive response. Yes, we're seeing the de-Teflonization that's going on in Washington, and I'm glad for that, but economically, nobody is taking the lead, and I'm speaking from a lot of years in the labor movement, with anywhere near the authenticity and power that the organized faith groups are. I think that this is a new thing, and has impact.
And you have worked, just to change the subject a little bit, with a union which, in my view, the United Electrical Workers, has consistently been one of the most progressive and democratic and decent unions in this country. It's a union that has been hit hard, as I understand it, within the last few years by the decline of manufacturing in the United States, and by a lot of opposition, as you always have had, from manufacturing itself. You've been a strong, militant union, and some of the employers have not been overly sympathetic to the United Electrical Workers. What are you seeing in terms of how workers, is there a demoralization now among workers?
Certainly there is. There has to be, because this kind of business, I mean, we've heard for many, many years, decades in fact, if you don't do less and so, we're going to move out. Now
Right.
they mean it. They mean it. And if only one factory out of 10 that makes that threat does it, the other 9 have leverage that's just unbelievable.
And that raises that whole issue of powerlessness. You know, the pretense is that we live in a democratic society, right? You have the right to control your own life. But what you're saying, in essence, is that if a worker speaks up on the job, does not take a concession in his or her wages, then the company's going to say, you don't want a concession? No problem. We're going to pick up and move. So your choice is either a concession or no job at all, which is a hell of an option for a human being to have to deal with.
Right. We can show you the bruises all over the place. For, you know, within 3 days after the election, I'm not picking on General Motors just gratuitously, they announced the closing of 11 major plants within 3 days after the election.
Coincidental, no doubt.
Coincidence.
Right.
So I think that it's wrong to say that history repeats itself endlessly and, you know, you don't recognize anything new. The fact is, in terms of powerlessness, we are in an unprecedented position. I'm talking about working people and farmers.
Sure.
Certainly.
Sure. You know, it's a funny, again, you talk about living in a democratic society, but what does that mean when your job is, where is the rights? What can one say? Who can one vote for? Because in this instance, it seems clear to me, all of the power rests with a corporation that looks at the bottom line and says, hey, we can make more money by shutting down. And the workers have, although many of these people for GM probably have worked in those plants for what, 20, 30, 40 years,
Oh.
their entire lives, they have had no say. They walk into work one day and there's a press conference and they're gone again. We saw that here in Vermont, not very long ago in terms of what happened in Goodyear. In Windsor, we saw it here in South Burlington. Lucille, in terms of powerlessness, now these are workers already who have had gainful employment, some of them earning decent union wages. They are powerlessness. They are powerless. What are we talking about when you are talking about people who literally every single day have got to scramble just to get food in their mouths? What is?
Well, I mean, I think number one, we can begin to imagine, if we can, what it's like to feel hungry, and how you literally feel, not just physically but emotionally. I think that's the beginning point. I think you can then move to what happens if you don't have a house or a roof over your head. I mean, I can't even begin to fathom what that would be like for myself. I know that people are, for the most part, oftentimes desperately depressed. Sometimes they're victims of alcoholism or drug addiction. Not all, but many. And then you have to ask the question, why? Why that? People don't have a sense of themselves, or any sense of self-esteem. And I don't know how we can expect that they would if they don't have the basic necessities. I mean, our staff will say, on the 3 days a year that we're open 24 hours a day, will say what a difference there is when an individual can just stay, can stay in, don't have to worry about going out on the street. It's a whole different thing in the world.
And isn't it true also that part of that powerlessness is to opt out of the democratic process entirely?
That's right.
I think what people, your point, Lucille, is it's very hard to imagine, even if one has sympathy or political concern, what it's like every single day, and the challenge of the day is basically to live that day, to figure out where you're going to stay when the shelter closes, at least you have a place to sleep, and what do you do for the remaining parts of the day? Where do you eat? What do you do to keep yourselves alive? You're outside of the system. And it is, I think one of the problems that we all have is we don't have that empathy to understand how people feel and how we can change that. I should mention that obviously we intend to make some progress on that particular problem with COTS in trying to keep the shelter open more hours during the day so that people will have a place to stay. All right, maybe we're running out of time. I want to thank Sister Lucille Bonvaleur, who is with the Sisters of Mercy, and Ed Block, who is with the Religious Labor Coalition from New York State, with sharing their ideas with us. And to say that I hope that in coming months, here in the city of Burlington and throughout the state of Vermont, we will be discussing more widely what the implications are of this pastoral letter entitled Economic Justice for All is about. Because I think as we three agree, it's an extremely important document trying to bring to real life religious and moral feelings about justice. Thank you all for watching. Thanks to our guests. We'll see you again next week.
Thank you.